Well, welcome back to another episode of Stand on Guard with David Krayden. I'm your host, David Krayden, and we're going to talk today about how Justin Trudeau has hit a new low. We'll be back in a minute with that. So we are in a very precarious position in this country. We need political change, but we also need the resolve to resist. Now, I want to discuss something before we get into that major story about the new low. If it's possible for Justin Trudeau to hit a new low, it always is. You know, he hits the bottom and then he gets a shovel and starts to dig. And that's exactly what Justin Trudeau is all about. But I wanted to mention, support independent journalism, support this station, watch the clips we're putting up. So we've repackaged a lot of them because we're having a little bit of problem with YouTube in terms of the clips we put up. And to satisfy sometimes their very demanding demands, we've had to repackage a lot. So please watch them and support us, subscribe, ring the bell, and give us those watch hours. Watch the whole thing. Watch the whole show. Watch the whole clip, because we need those watch hours so we can continue to stay on the air and get the monetization, which we missed with a sliver in the last examination assessment by YouTube. But we're going back. We're getting the watch hours as per their demand, and we're going to continue to bring you the news that you need to see. Now, I want to get on to our story here, because it's absolutely fascinating what Trudeau has done in the House of Commons. Now, what's been going on this week, if you haven't been watching, is that Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre has been insisting that the government axe the carbon tax and get to balancing the budget, or it's going to filibuster the Liberals' budget bill. And it began to do that last night, Wednesday night this week. It began the filibuster with opposition leader Pierre Poilievre leading the charge. But this is a great exchange Wednesday in the House of Commons, and I want you to watch this.
Mr. Speaker, we don't need another drama performance, because at the end of the day, when theatrics collides with mathematics, the math always wins. And after 8 years of this Prime Minister, the Canadians have a stock of combined debt that is bigger than our entire GDP. In fact, we are the most indebted families of any country in the G7. The IMF says that Canada is the #1 at-risk country for mass mortgage defaults. Will he reverse his inflationary and high interest rate policies before people go broke?
Prime Minister.
Speaker, I've answered this question a few times, but the Leader of the Opposition continues to ask it because he refuses to go outside and see what is actually happening in Canada. Forest fires are raging. It's the worst year on record for forest fires already, but the fact is they are going to get worse in the coming years because climate change is real. And yet the Conservative Party continues to stand against the climate action that we've been taking, stand against the investments that we're making to support families, to support first responders. They continue to stand against help for Canadians who are losing their homes, losing their families, losing their livelihood.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Has he really sunk into the low of exploiting these fires for political gain to distract from his inflationary and high interest rate policies? Is that what it's come to? That he's so ashamed of his economic policy and record?
I'm going to have to interrupt this because I'm getting noise from both sides. I know you can handle it. You do that well. But what I need to have is I want to hear what's being said, and I'm sure both sides want to hear what's being said. I'm going to ask him to start from the top, please.
Mr. Speaker, this Prime Minister has just lowered himself to the worst steps to try and distract from his disastrous economic record, he's now using the forest fires to change the channel. This is even lower than I would have expected from him. Mr. Speaker, Canadians are going to sit down tonight to discuss how they're going to move into a small apartment because they're going to have to give up their homes after his inflationary policies have driven up interest rates on Canadian mortgage holders who have record debt. Will the Prime Minister keep the promise he made 6 months ago to balance the budget and bring down inflation and interest rates before folks go broke?
Yeah, interesting, because there's a lot of things going on here. And first of all, I want to address this forest fire issue. We put a poll out this week on Krayden's Right. Only one person responded to say that climate change is the reason for these forest fires that are creating a catastrophe across Canada, from the west to the Maritimes. This is a huge problem, but a lot of people are identifying arson and bad forestry management as the primary reason. And there is a lot of evidence in the media right now that people are deliberately setting fires and causing this. Trudeau has absolutely no firm or final evidence that there's any causal relationship between forest fires and climate change. Nobody's denying climate change. We're denying that there's a direct causal relationship, and that every time there's a forest fire or an increase in forest fires is necessarily linked to climate change. But Trudeau has the nerve to suggest if you don't support his climate change program, which adds up to really one thing, the carbon tax, that you are responsible for the forest fires. He has the gall to suggest the Conservatives for not backing his climate change policies, read carbon tax, that they are responsible. Now, this is outlandish. This is outrageous. When the latest carbon tax goes through, Canadians will be spending 61 cents a liter every time they fill up, just in carbon tax plus GST. Now, I remember, and I'm not talking about the 1980s here, when we were able to buy a liter of gas for about 65 cents a liter. It wasn't that long ago when the price dropped that low. But now we're going to be paying 61 cents in carbon tax and GST alone. Now, that's a heck of a lot of expense. And what Poilievre is trying to say here is that Trudeau wants to change the channel because he doesn't want to acknowledge inflationary spending. He keeps talking about targeted non-inflationary spending, which is a crock. Trudeau has never demonstrated anything like non-inflationary targeted spending. It has been widespread spending. During the pandemic, during COVID-19, he spent even more than his finance minister, Bill Morneau, thought was advisable. And a lot of that money didn't even go towards helping people affected or impacted by the pandemic. So what does this all add up to? Trudeau is lying about how he's spending, about how his spending is affecting inflation, and how the inflation then affects interest rates. And those interest rates went up again this week by another 25 basis points. Every time they go up, people are spending hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars more on mortgage payments by month, by year. Now, this is an issue that affects a lot of Canadians. And Trudeau says, don't worry about your house. We've got a grocery rebate for you in the mail. Well, I tell you, if you lose your house and you can't even afford to live in an apartment, the rent of which is more than most people are paying for their mortgage, I don't think the grocery rebate's going to help very much when you're eating on the street. But that's exactly what Trudeau is doing. He's trying to change the channel. He wants to talk about climate change and nothing but climate change, and to blame the forest fires not only on climate change, but on the Conservative Party, because he doesn't want to talk about the fiscal reality he has created, which is catastrophic for people, and it's getting worse. So I think Poilievre has a good point here. The carbon tax needs to be axed and it has to be stopped. It should be repealed, but it's certainly, we do not need to build upon the carbon tax even further. And this is a disaster. Now, I can't say anything more about this. I'm sure you're suffering from higher prices everywhere, and probably from higher prices with your mortgage. And you know the reality. Justin Trudeau will never know that reality. He grew up a millionaire's son. He's been living at the public expense as prime minister, and he doesn't need to worry about economic reality like ordinary Canadians. And frankly, I don't think he knows any ordinary Canadians. And he has contempt for the ordinary Canadians, because just look at his attitude during the Freedom Convoy protest. Those were ordinary Canadians who were affected by his pandemic mandates. And he couldn't even meet with them. He didn't want to talk with them. He didn't even want to identify them except as misogynist, racist, and deplorable people who had no business protesting. So that's Trudeau's attitude towards ordinary people, the ones he doesn't want to meet with. Now I want to move on to our next topic, because, you know, Trudeau has done it again. He really has. He has done it again. And I just think this is absolutely outrageous. You might recall Trudeau was lecturing the Italian Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, about how Italy was apparently and supposedly abrogating LGBTQ, I can't say the rest of it, rights, whatever that means. And of course, what were they doing in Italy? Carting these folks off to concentration camps? And she flatly denied there was any reason for concern. But Trudeau made it clear he was going to dress down the Italian Prime Minister for this horrible abuse of human rights. What hypocrisy! This is the guy who abuses human rights perpetually in Canada, whether it's crushing protests from the Freedom Convoy, or freezing your bank account, or censoring your free speech on the internet. This is the guy who's abusive of human rights. But he did it again. And this is absolutely beautiful. I want you to see this.
The practice for Canadian governments, for my government, we bring up human rights concerns with friends, allies, and challenging partners around the world. And as friends, Canada and Poland will always have frank conversations on the things we're doing together and places where we raise concerns. I certainly raised concerns that we have around some of the reports coming out of Poland around LGBT.
Now, I just want to pause there for a second to say the media reported this story as Trudeau doing this in private. Clearly, he's not doing this in private. He's at a news conference and is dressing down the the Polish Prime Minister. So once again, the illusion of this is that Justin Trudeau is doing this in private, but he's embarrassing himself in Canada yet again.
Rights around democracy, and we had a frank conversation, as must be the case. We will continue to work together on a broad range of things, but we will continue to be there to stand up for the values that matter as well.
En français?
Voilà, okay. Comme est toujours le cas dans nos échanges francs avec nos amis et avec nos alliés, on souligne nos préoccupations, et j'ai souligné mes préoccupations par rapport au reportage sur la condition des personnes LGBT.
Now I want you to look at the Italian Prime Minister here. Doesn't look very pleased, does he? Can you just imagine what he's thinking? Does this swine, this moron, really think he can get away with this? Here he is raking me over the coals at a news conference. He probably didn't even expect this. But how does this guy have the gall to do this with what he's been doing in Canada? But of course he does.
Et des préoccupations au niveau de la démocratie avec le Premier ministre. Et nous allons continuer de souligner ces préoccupations. On a eu une bonne conversation franche là-dessus, comme on doit toujours le faire. Mais on va aussi toujours travailler ensemble avec nos alliés sur les grands enjeux et les valeurs qui nous unissent.
In Poland, rights of all the human rights and rights of LGBT people are not jeopardized at all. We very strongly put focus on nurturing families, supporting families, and sometimes it is misunderstood by some people as being discriminatory towards some other people, which is not the case. And the best proof of this is that we do not have issues with the European Commission from this point of view, because the normal so-called cohesion fund and other European funds would not be would not be granted for Poland had we experienced any issues from that point of view. Though that's the best proof of this. But on top of this, I can assure you there are no problems whatsoever. There are lots of misunderstandings, I reckon, and I can explain them even more in details. But this is not an issue in Poland.
No, not an issue in Poland, but Trudeau wants to make it an issue. And as a lot of people have pointed out to me this week, if I was a foreign leader and Trudeau wanted to meet with me, I'd say, forget it. Take a hike, head for the hills. I'm not talking with you, because all you're going to do is try to make a fool out of me when you have your next news conference. This kind of behavior is just disgusting. But, you know, Trudeau really thinks he can get away with it. And that's what makes it so disgusting. Now, I want to move quickly to a story I did this week for the Epoch Times, and I was quite proud of this because it's a really good story about what's happening in Calgary. Now, Calgary has gone mad, has absolutely gone mad. In the first place, they made it very difficult for parents to protest these drag queen story hours. Because you know what? Calgary City Council and the woke mayor, they're not offended by drag queen story hours for little children. But what they are offended by are pro-life demonstrators. So they enacted another law. And if pro-life demonstrators show up to protest and they have any pictures of aborted fetuses, like that's what abortion is all about, they have to hide them in an opaque envelope that's clearly labeled, warning, contents offensive. You know, it just makes me wonder, whatever happened to Calgary where they used to be offended by abortion? Oh, no, you have to go back a few years of that. But at least be offended by exposing children to this sort of nonsense. But no, they're really offended in Calgary by pro-life protests, and they're trying to make it even more difficult. They've been doing this for years. They made it impossible for pro-life demonstrators to appear before hospitals years ago, decades ago. Now they're making it next to impossible for them to protest anywhere else. And you can bet there's more coming, because this is a woke council and a woke mayor, and the city is increasingly gone crazy. So that's probably all we need to say about that one. But I want to move on to really the story that continues to brew. You know, and it was really quite astounding. The testimony was really quite astounding. And it was the David Johnston, Former Governor General David Johnston, special rapporteur, appeared before the committee that's investigating Chinese election interference. And he appeared to be completely at a loss, not only to understand why everybody is saying there's a conflict of interest here, you great friend of Justin Trudeau and the Trudeau family, you former member of the Trudeau Foundation, you guy who is part of the Ottawa establishment and really is working for Justin Trudeau. And I love how the Conservatives have now describe him as the loyal rapporteur instead of the special rapporteur, because that's what he's doing. So I want to let's watch a bit of this testimony, because this week they had Jenny Kwan, who is an NDP MP from Vancouver East, very NDP writing, but CSIS revealed to her that she was targeted by China, by the communist Chinese government. And she was really mad about this. But CSIS told her. And apparently it didn't tell David Johnston, or David Johnston did not. And Jagmeet Singh, who of course vacillates from one side to the other, can't decide whether he wants to oppose Trudeau or stay in his non-aggression pact with Trudeau. He was there asking some pretty good questions too. And we've got a great question from Michael Cooper, one of my favorite MPs from St. Albert, Edmonton, and he's there as well. So let's have a listen to this.
I want to point out a particularly concerning different conclusion that you arrived at in comparison to Mr. O'Toole, and I want to highlight Mr. O'Toole raised a question of privilege, and he indicated, and I just want to quote a portion of what he said with my time remaining, that the briefing he received from CSIS confirmed to me, this is Mr. O'Toole, what I suspected for quite some time, that my party, several members of my caucus, and I were targets of misinformation and voter suppression, and that was orchestrated by China before and during the 2021 election. So members of the Conservative caucus and himself were targeted. In your report, you find that in reference to Mr. Chu, who was, of course, a member of the Conservative Party and a candidate in the 2021 election, that misinformation could not be traced to a state-sponsored source. So we've got two very different conclusions from a CSIS briefing that Mr. O'Toole is referring to, and then you're stating in your report that there was no clear evidence that it was state-sponsored. How could you have such different conclusions from what Mr. O'Toole received?
Well, again, Madam Chair, I appreciate that particular question, and I've asked to be brief. We did have an opportunity to meet with Mr. O'Toole shortly before our report was completed, and did take into consideration what he had to say to us. And I must say he has been a very knowledgeable, thoughtful person about this, and has much more to contribute. The evidence that we had before us that permitted us to come to the conclusion you've just suggested was what was available to us at that time. I think since that time, the conversations that Mr. O'Toole has had with the director of CSIS, I think there's been a much greater step in terms of what should have been done and what must be done in the future.
Thank you.
Now, if we can just listen to this. Does Mr. Johnston not appear to be completely out of it here? He looks awful. I'm sure there's a great strain of this office, probably more strenuous than the office of Governor General, which he held for a number of years. But he looks like he is really not doing very well. But is it because his hands are tied and he just simply can't tell the whole truth? If you read his report, it's like he just read the newspapers, the media clippings, the internet stories. There's no intelligence there. There's no information. There's no special information. It's just all he's doing is paraphrasing and regurgitating the news stories. So it's difficult to know what the point was. But let's listen to Michael Cooper here as he continues.
With respect to that, the information that we had did not permit us to conclude that there was a state-sponsored force. There may be other information that would make that clear, but that was not clear to us at the time.
Communist Party media accounts
with one account having 26 million followers, but you made the unequivocal statement that there was nothing to indicate recirculation and amplification by the Beijing regime. You further cite on page 25 of your report that in reference to the misinformation directed at then Member of Parliament Kenny Chiu, that it too could, quote, not be traced to a state-sponsored source, even though, Mr. Johnson, were you not aware that on September 10th, an account associated with HuiNet, I'm mispronouncing it, but HuiNet, which is connected to the United Front Work Department, posted disinformation from another Global Times article, this time targeted at Kenny Chiu, and yet you make that unequivocal statement in your report. How is that possible?
Madam Chair, through you, let me refer specifically to what we said on that matter on page 25. Chinese Canadian MPs, including Mr. Chiu, were and remain of particular interest to the PRC. There was online misinformation about Mr. Chiu's proposed foreign agent legislation, which he corrected in the media during the campaign. But the misinformation could not be traced to a state-sponsored source. The government does not regulate consumption of social media during elections or otherwise. However, it has engaged with social media platforms to deal with misinformation and the threat that it poses to election security. This does not include WeChat, which is based in the PRC.
I read the report several times over. Quoting it again, to me, is not going to answer that question. My question was, did Mr. Johnston look into who changed that memo and why it was changed?
Madam Chair, again, I must be conscious of the classified information. The memo that appeared in Global News...
Sorry, I'm just going to interrupt for a second here, Madam Chair. It's a yes or no question. Did Mr. Johnston look into who changed it? Yes or no?
The answer to that question is the memo that was referred to in the Global News report was an early draft that had certain statements. The draft was not circulated further. There was a final draft that completed quite a different conclusion of what transpired.
Thank you. Madam Chair, if I could just finish my thought, then I take that to mean that Mr. Johnston did not ask the question who changed it and why it was changed.
Yeah, that's absolutely tortuous. You know, it's difficult to watch. And I've got to say, until Johnston took this position as special rapporteur, which Canadians had never even heard of this position before. But Justin Trudeau obviously was advised to, I'm sure he had never heard of it before either. But before Johnston took this role, I had a fairly positive impression of him because Jean Chrétien, former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, had appointed so many yahoos into the post of Governor General that he seemed like a refreshing change. This was seemed like a fairly normal guy, and it didn't have apparently far left politics or these horrible axes to grind. But I had no idea that David Johnston was so enamored of Pierre Trudeau and Justin Trudeau and the Trudeau family, and was such basically a liberal insider. I had no idea. When he took on this role, all of that information came out, and came out quickly, like a flood. Because we know he has no credibility now. And he looks like a man struggling to find his place as he gives his testimony. He looks like a man who's barely there. He looks like a man who's lost his credibility. He once had fairly good standing, a fairly good public stature, and he's lost that because he looks like he's been bought by Justin Trudeau and the Liberal government. He looks like a man who's in Trudeau's pocket, and he didn't need to do this. I don't think he needed the money, and I wondered why he took this job. knowing full well, if he's even half as intelligent as Trudeau says he is, that people are going to figure this out pretty quickly. And the media is going to dig and discover all of those skeletons in his closet. I mean, the guy has been hiring liberal people who have donated, liberal donors, onto his staff. He hired a crisis management team before there was even a crisis to manage. Obviously, he was expecting one. So he's lost all credibility in this process, and it's quite sad. It really is quite sad. But sad or not, he needs to go. And he needs to listen to Parliament, which voted overwhelmingly last week that he should go. Trudeau can ignore that. He can ignore that. But they do that at their peril because that is contrary to all good democratic tradition and democratic history in Canada. The Liberals are in a minority position, and they have to remember that. So as we leave you today, I want to reiterate, support independent journalism. It is important. We need to stay on the air to give you the news, to give you those reports the mainstream media isn't necessarily showing you, because we're digging into the testimony, in the question period. We're broadcasting question period every day until Parliament recesses for the summer, because this is important stuff. You know, I hear some people say fiscal news is boring. Well, it's not boring when your paycheck isn't meeting the demands of your life, when you can't pay your bills, when you can't pay your mortgage, when you can't fill up your gas tank to go to work. That's called life. And this is what this government is ignoring right now, are basic needs, as much as they are ignoring basic democratic values by imposing a very authoritarian style of government on Canada. And here at Krayden's Right, at Stand on Guard, we are going to continue to fight those policies, and we need your support. So watch those clips we're putting up every day. Watch the Take 5 sessions I do 2 to 3 times a week. Continue to watch Stand on Guard every Thursday, sometimes on the weekends, but we're going to continue to do this because we're fighting for you. And I think that's so important. Thanks for tuning in today. We're going to be back next week, and we've got another Take 5 coming very soon. And we'll be at you this afternoon with question period. Thank you very much for tuning in today. And for Stand on Guard, I am